everybody, it's Clarke with the July 2013 edition of Wall Street and Washington. Today I'd like to cover three things. First, I'd like to say why the recent CFTC Cross-Border Swaps Agreement is not the end of the story. Second, I'd like to talk about why viewers need to keep their eyes on the potential US-EU free trade agreement. And third, I'd like to say a few things about the surprisingly perverse political results from June's federal budget surplus. First, in terms of the recent CFTC Cross-Border Swaps Rule, absolutely it was a milestone for the CFTC to finalize this rule. It obviously was a long road, and as I'd expected, and frankly many other analysts had expected, ultimately the product doesn't change at a macro level the current rules in terms of application of U.S. law to transactions that occur outside the U.S. To be more specific, if swaps transactions occur in the U.S., Dodd-Frank rules apply. However, if transactions involving, say, a U.S. affiliate occur in another jurisdiction, under this current rule, under the final rule, those transactions will be covered by the rules of that particular jurisdiction where the transaction occurred, so long as those rules are deemed to be equivalent or comparable to the Dodd-Frank rules. Now that's all great. However, there are a ton of exceptions and potential loopholes in this final agreement, and I want to talk about just two. One area that I think is going to be problematic going forward is that the agreement does not cover clearinghouses. Obviously, going forward in both the US and in Europe, clearinghouses are going to play an increasing role as swaps are required to be cleared through them. One area, again, in which the agreement is largely silent is how do you handle the differing rules for clearinghouses in US and Europe? And there are some ways in which they're quite different. So again, that's going to be a thorny area going forward. Second, the agreement also says that the rules of another jurisdiction will apply so long as those rules are roughly comparable or equivalent to U.S. requirements. Sounds great, right? Who could be against that? However, devil's in the details. How do you actually determine whether or not a jurisdiction's rules are truly equivalent to the now relatively comprehensive Dodd-Frank rules? There is a ton of uncertainty around that. The CFTC is going to be stepping through jurisdiction by jurisdiction, country by country, whether or not they think rules are equivalent in coming months. But then remember, at the same time, we're likely to have a fair amount of turnover, including potentially Chairman Gensler's seat at the CFTC. So again, a ton of uncertainty around the equivalency or comparability element of the agreement. And as I say, that adds up to a lot more story to be told on the CFTC cross-border agreement in coming months. Second, I'd like to talk about the potential US-EU free trade agreement. Now, I find that most people in the financial services sector very rationally have not really been paying attention to this issue, and you may not need to, but what I do want to do is put on your screen the possibility that you may need to, because right now, EU Financial Services Commissioner Michel Barnier is engaged in a full-throated effort to try to get financial services regulation to be included as part of a free trade agreement. Now, why does that matter? Well, it matters because basically any of the U.S. rules then, for instance, Dodd-Frank, in theory, it's not too much to say that virtually every aspect of Dodd-Frank could be up for discussion with the EU, and the EU, in terms of trying to set some sort of minimum standards, could one way or another, for good or for bad, depending upon your perspective, change the rules for Dodd-Frank or any other area. For instance, insurance is an area that Commissioner Barnier has focused on and would like equivalency between the US and the EU. I'm not going to go through all the potential permutations, but you can see very quickly that this area, if financial services regulation were included in this agreement, this area would be rife with all sorts of uncertainty and, again, potential good or bad depending upon where you sit. Lastly, I'd like to say a few words about the June budget surplus. Didn't get as much attention as I expected, but the federal budget, or the federal treasury, took in $60 billion more in revenue than we expended during the month of June. In other words, we had a $60 billion surplus at Treasury. That's obviously a good thing as an American. It's a good thing from a budget perspective longer term as we see the impacts of sequestration and some higher tax increases. We expect that trend very broadly to continue. However, in terms of looking at the results from that, what that actually does from a political perspective is to harden the fault lines in Washington that lead towards gridlock. Let me say a few things about that. Democrats look at the budget surplus and they say, the time for austerity is over. No way are we going to talk about future cuts going forward. Republicans, particularly in the House, don't buy that argument. They say budget surplus is perfect, but the fact is we're running deficits as far as the eye can see, and we need to continue cutting. That means, I would say, that it's really the proverbial nail in the tax reform coffin, as I've been saying for some time now. I don't think tax reform is going to happen in this Congress. I think this dynamic ensures it's not going to happen in this Congress. It almost virtually ensures, too, that no grand bargain on taxes or spending is going to occur. And finally, as I've been saying all along, viewers need to keep focused on this fall, particularly around October, when we have the federal budget year begins October 1, so spending decisions need to be made around that time. And at virtually the same time, the federal debt ceiling will be bumped up against, and we'll have to increase that debt ceiling. Again, in a kind of perverse way, this June surplus hardens fault lines so that when we head into those events in October-ish, you're likely to see a lot of fireworks. I continually have said I do think that we're unlikely to see a shutdown, but I do also believe at the same time there's going to be a lot of noise, a lot of shouting before it's all done, and that obviously can lead to a lot of uncertainty. With that, I'll wrap things up, and we'll see you next month on Wall Street and Washington.